This is Professor Michael Fournet, and this is Introduction to Microeconomics. This is the lecture for week 4. The lecture this week focuses on the very powerful but very useful concept called elasticity, and it's discussed in chapter 6 in your textbook. For this particular lecture, you will need to have at your disposal the 2 handouts that I made available to you. The first one was the interpretation of elasticity values, which gave us kind of the means of interpreting the different type of elasticity results. And you also need the handout on the price elasticity of demand characteristics, which gave us a little more insight in terms of what it means to have different types of price elasticity of demand. So if you have those handy, it will definitely help as we go through this inquiry in the chapter. The first thing we'll look at in this chapter is we want to look at the concept of elasticity itself. Elasticity is a concept that gives precision to our results, so it's very useful. Elasticity the term kind of implies flexibility or stretching, and so it is telling us how something is reacting or stretching in response to something else. So a good kind of generic way of thinking about elasticity, it measures precisely how something else will react or respond to a precise change in something, and those changes are expressed in percentage terms. For example, if something increases by 10%, how will the something else respond to such an increase? Will it also increase by 10%? Will that something else decrease by 30%? Will that something else not react at all? So elasticity tells us exactly how the something else is going to respond when something changes. Now in this chapter, there are 4 types of elasticity that we will investigate. And one of the types, particularly the type called price elasticity of demand, this one gets the bulk of our attention because price elasticity of demand has lots of useful applications, and we will look at some in this lecture. What price elasticity of demand tells us, it tells us precisely how it tells us how consumer purchases of a good will react to a change in the price of the good. Price elasticity of demand is really taking the law of demand and being more precise with it. Because in chapter 3, for example, we studied the law of demand. We said price goes up, the quantity demanded goes down. Price goes down, the quantity demanded goes up, etc. parables. And those relationships were true, but we need more precision. We want to entertain questions like, what if price increases 10%? How much does the quantity demanded drop? So price elasticity of demand is a way of measuring how the quantity demanded will react to a change in price. Will it change a lot? Will it change a little? Will it not change at all? Price elasticity of demand will tell us that. Similarly, price elasticity of supply is giving more precision to the law of supply. So the law of supply, as we learned about in chapter 3, told us that if price goes up, the quantity supply goes up. Price goes down, the quantity supply goes down, etc. parables. That is true, but we need more precision. If the price, for example, goes up 3%, will a seller increase production by 3%? Will a seller increase production by 10%? Will a seller increase production by 50%? Price elasticity of supply tells us how the quantity supply will react to a change in price. So it's just taking the law of supply and being more precise with it. The other 2 types of elasticity that are reflected in this chapter, the third one is called income elasticity of demand. And as the name suggests, income elasticity of demand, this one is related to demand theory in chapter 3. Because in chapter 3, as we were looking at demand determinants, we found that how income affected demand depended on whether the good was normal or inferior. So what income elasticity of demand allows us to do, it allows us to determine whether a good is normal or inferior. So if the income changes by a certain amount, how will it affect consumer purchases? Will consumer purchases go up? Will consumer purchases go down? And by what percentage? So income elasticity of demand is just a simple way of determining whether a good is normal or inferior. Alright, cross elasticity of demand also has linkage back to chapter 3. And that cross elasticity of demand is a way of determining whether two goods are substitutes or complementary. In the case of substitute goods for chapter 3, when the price of one would go up, the demand for the other would go up. So there was a positive relationship between the price of one and the demand for the other good when they were substitutes. When the goods were complementary, when the price would go up, the demand for the other would go down. So the relationship between complementary goods was inverse or negative. So cross elasticity of demand is simply a way of determining whether two goods are substitutes or complements. Okay? And so what we want to do is we want to take some data and some numbers and calculate each type of elasticity, try to make sense of the results, and so we can get better understanding of their significance and their usefulness. And to help me do that, I've created some sample data sources. For example, our first calculation will be price elasticity of demand. And so if you notice I've used the symbol E sub D for price elasticity of demand. And so we'll use the data from the demand schedule that I've created here to do the calculation. So I have a simple demand schedule, and this demand schedule contains prices, the price of the goods, $6, $5, $4, and it also contains the quantity demanded. 1,000 units, 2,000 units, 3,000 units. So notice when the price goes down, the quantity goes up. So the data is consistent with the law of demand. Price goes down, the quantity demanded increases. Now the numbers that I've indicated in red, the $6 price, the $5 price, the 1,000 units, and the 2,000 units, those are going to be the numbers I'm going to plug into my elasticity of demand formula to see what type of elasticity I can discover. So in place of the variable P0, I'm going to use $6. In place of the variable P1, I'm going to substitute $5. In place of the variable Q0 in the formula, I'm going to substitute 1,000 units. In the place of the variable Q1, I'm going to substitute 2,000 units. Alright, you might want to jot down these prices and quantities so that when I make the substitution, you can follow along. So in order to do that, we need to go to our next exhibit here. And in this exhibit, I'm calculating or demonstrating what I call price elasticity of demand analysis. And I think it's very useful, particularly when you're learning for the first time, to do things kind of on a step-by-step basis, so that you can kind of, have an organized way of proceeding through this new material. And so for price elasticity of demand, I suggest using a three-step approach. The first step would be to calculate the coefficient. And when I say coefficient, the coefficient is the elasticity result, the number. So we want to calculate that elasticity number. And then once we calculated that elasticity number, we want to classify it into one of the 5 price elasticity of demand categories. So in the interpretation of elasticity value handout, there were 5 distinct categories for price elasticity of demand, and our results have to be classified into one of them. Alright, so once we've done the classification, then we will take our result and go back and restate precisely the law of demand. So instead of simply saying price goes up, quantity demanded goes down, we'll now express our results in percentage terms, which are 4 more precise. Alright, so let me demonstrate step 1. So I took the numbers from the demand schedule that we had in the previous slide, and here you can, here's the basic formula for price elasticity of demand. In the numerator you have the way of expressing percentage change in quantity, and denominator you're expressing percentage change in price. This formula is called the midpoint method for calculating price elasticity of demand. So in place of Q1 I substituted 2,000, in place of Q0 I substituted 1,000, in place of price 1 I substituted $5, and in place of price 0 I substituted $6. And so I just then proceeded to dissolve the calculation down until I arrived at the number of a negative 3.659%. Now the reason why I got a negative 3.659%, or a negative number, is because there's an inverse relationship in the law of demand between price and quantity demanded. So if price goes up, the quantity demanded would go down. So any result I get, unless I get 0%, it's going to be negative because of that negative relationship between price and quantity demanded. So what I have to do is I have to take the absolute value of the result to make the result non-negative or positive. So I did that. I took the absolute value and I got a result of 3.659%. Now the elasticity coefficient's value, 3.659%, when I try to classify that into one of those 5 categories, in my step 2 I see that the value of the coefficient is less than infinity but greater than 1. So 3.659% falls between 1 and infinity, and so that implies that the result I have discovered would be considered elastic, which, if you have looked at the characteristics of price elasticity of demand, that implies that the consumers are somewhat price sensitive, between, in this case, between $5 and $6. So I classify the result as representing elastic demand. Now, then I take the result and I go back to the law of demand and I restate the law of demand very precisely. So instead of saying price goes up, quantity demanded goes down, now I can state it like such. I did my calculation between $5 and $6. So my results apply to this interval between $5 and $6. And so in that interval between $5 and $6, if the price of the good changes by 1%, the assumed 1% change in price is an assumption associated with the formula. So the elasticity formula assumes a 1% change in price. So it's designed that way. So if the price changes by 1%, then the quantity demanded of the good will change by 3.659% in the opposite direction. So now instead of simply saying price goes up and quantity demanded goes down, I now can say if the price between $5 and $6 changes by 1%, the quantity will change by 3.659% in the opposite direction. And that type of precision helps me to really determine how to apply price elasticity of demand in some very useful applications. So now I'm stating the law of demand very precisely. Alright? So that's how you would calculate price elasticity of demand. The next one we'll look at is price elasticity of supply. So our next calculation would be price elasticity of supply. And since elasticity of supply is restating the law of supply, I need a supply schedule from which to get the data. And so I have a nice supply schedule here. The price ranging from $7 down to $5 to $3, and the corresponding quantity supplied ranging from 30,000 units to 25,000 units to 20,000 units. So the price falls, the quantity supplied falls. So the supply schedule I'm using is in fact consistent with the law of supply. And so, like before, I have designated some of the prices. $5 is to the variable piece of 1, the $3 price to piece of 0, the 25,000 units to cuse of 1, and the 20,000 units to the variable cuse of 0. So I take those numbers and I go back and plug them into the price elasticity of supply formula and see what result I get. So if you need to jot down those prices and quantities, please do so. Alright, so let's go and substitute them in and see what we get. Alright, so now for doing price elasticity of supply, I approach it the same way. I use a three-step approach. I calculate in the first step the elasticity coefficient, then I classify the coefficient, and then I reinterpret the results with respect, in this case, to the law of supply. Alright, so in the first step, I take in the price elasticity of supply formula. In place of Q1, I put 25,000. In place of Q0, I put 20,000. In place of price of 1, I put $5. And in place of piece of 0, I put $3. And then I just go through and dissolve it down until I get a single coefficient value. In this case, I got 0.444%. And notice here the result is positive. And that's explainable too, because the relationship between price and quantity supplied, according to the law of supply, is positive. Price goes up, quantity supplied goes up. Price goes down, quantity supplied goes down. So it makes sense that the results I get for a price elasticity of supply calculation should be non-negative. Alright, so I've got the 0.444% as my coefficient. I then take that value and classify it into one of the 5 price elasticity of supply categories, which are reflected in the interpretation of elasticity value handout. Because 0.44 is less than 1 but greater than 0, that would imply that the price elasticity of supply would be considered inelastic. So I've discovered inelastic supply. Okay. Now I take the coefficient and I go and restate the law of supply, and then I will have a more precise means of understanding how producers will react to a change in price. Alright, and so in step 3, I restate the law of supply. Again, my calculation is very specific. It's between $3 and $5, so that my result only applies over that price range. So between $3 and $5, if price changes by 1%, the quantity supply will change by 0.444% in the same direction. So if price goes up by 1%, I can expect the quantity supply to increase by 0.44% in the same direction. Okay. So we now calculated price elasticity of supply. Alright, let's go back and take a look at the other 2 types of elasticity. Namely, let's take a look at income elasticity of supply. Right, and so to do an income elasticity calculation, which I use the symbol E sub I, to do an income elasticity calculation, I need some income data and some purchase data. So I've created a little table that has in one column annual income, and in the other column it has purchases or quantity demanded. So when the annual income is $20,000, 1 unit of something would be purchased. When the annual income is $50,000, 2 units of something would be purchased, and so forth. Alright, so from the income schedule, I designate one of the income values as I sub 1, in this case $20,000. The other income value I assign to I sub 0, which in this case would be $50,000. For the quantity Q1, I will assign that 1 unit, and for the quantity Q sub 0, I will assign that 2 units. So I take those numbers and I plug them into the income elasticity formula and see what result I get. So if you need to note those numbers, please do so as we go make the inquiry. Alright, so now we go and take a look at income elasticity of demand. And here, income elasticity of demand, the inquiry is quite simple. Is much simpler. And so we can reduce it down to a two-step process. The first thing you want to do, of course, is calculate the elasticity coefficient. That's where you take the numbers and plug them into the income elasticity formula. Here you have percentage change in quantity in the numerator, and the denominator you have percentage change in income. So in place of the quantities, I put, in place of Q1, I put the 1 unit. In place of Q0, I put the 2 units. And in place of the income, I sub 1, I substitute $20,000. In place of the income, I sub 0, I substitute $50,000. And then I just dissolve the fraction down until I get a value. In this case, my coefficient, my income elasticity coefficient, is 0.778%. Now, so in the second step, now that I have the coefficient, I just need to interpret what it means. And in the second step, we're trying to determine whether the good is normal or inferior. And since the elasticity coefficient is greater than 0, it's positive, we can conclude that the good in question, whatever that good is a normal good. Because for a normal good, there's a positive relationship between income and purchases. So a positive coefficient means the good is normal. And these results can be interpreted from the interpretation of elasticity value handout that I gave you. Okay, so for income elasticity demand, 2 steps. Calculate the coefficient. If the coefficient is positive, say the good is normal. If the coefficient is negative, say the good is inferior. And that's it. That's all it does. Alright, let's look at the last one. The last one we'll look at is cross elasticity of demand. And for doing, and I use the symbol E sub xy in this case, for doing this one, because cross elasticity of demand is trying to determine whether 2 goods are complements or substitutes, I'm going to need, in effect, 2 demand schedules, 2 partial demand schedules. And so I have a demand schedule here for good X, and I have another demand schedule for a good Y. Okay? And so to do the calculation, I take 2 of the quantities for good X, 2 of the quantity values for good X, and the 2 corresponding price values for good Y. Okay? So for QX1, which would be the quantity demanded data for good X, I'm using the 90,000 units. For QX0, I'm using 100,000. And then I take the price data for good Y. I'll let $50 represent what I'm calling PY sub 1. And for the other price, PY sub 0, I'll use the $30. So I take those prices for good Y, I take those quantities for good X, and I go and plug them into the cross elasticity formula. And when I do that, I am engaging in cross elasticity of demand analysis, and it's a 2-step process, just like income elasticity of demand. First thing you do is calculate the elasticity coefficient, and then once you've done that, based on the coefficient value, you determine whether the goods are substitutes or complements. So again, I'll take the cross elasticity formula, where I have the quantity demanded for good X data in the numerator and the price data for good Y in the denominator. And then I substitute the values as indicated previously into the formula, and I dissolve it down to get a result. And so in this case, for the cross elasticity calculation, I got a negative 0.210%. And since my coefficient is negative, since E sub xy is less than 0, negative, that implies that the 2 goods, X and Y, are complementary goods. So, and that's all we're trying to find, is whether the goods are substitutes or complements, and because the coefficient is negative, That implies when the price of one goes up, the purchase of the other goes down, and so the goods will be complementary. Right? So those are the four types of elasticity and how to analyze and calculate them and make sense of the results. Right? The last thing we want to look at involving elasticity is there is an application that that looks at focuses on price elasticity of demand, because price elasticity of demand is very useful, and one of its uses is it helps us to determine how elasticity influences revenue. So if I have a business and I want to try and maximize my revenue, make as much money flow into my business as possible, understanding elasticity, price elasticity of demand, will be very helpful. Knowing how sensitive my customers are to price changes would help me to price in such a way to make the most possible revenue. And so I've created this table that shows that if we discover that the demand exerted by the customers is elastic, elastic customers are price sensitive, and so to appease their price sensitivity, your pricing strategy should be to lower the price. And if you lower the price, the interesting thing is your revenue will actually go up. And the reason why the revenue goes up is at the very heart of what elastic demand means. Elastic demand means that the percentage change in quantity is greater than the percentage change in price. So if you lower the price a small amount, a small percentage, the quantity is going to increase by a greater amount. And so the increase in quantity is going to make the revenue start to increase. It's what I call the quantity effect. So for elastic demand, the percentage change in quantity is greater than the percentage change in price. So if you lower the price a little, the quantity will respond by increasing by a larger amount. And so the quantity is going to then drive up. The increase in quantity will then drive up the total revenue. By the same token, if you discover that your customers are exhibiting inelastic behavior, which means that the customers are not very price sensitive, and so for those customers that are not very price sensitive, you can raise the price. And if you raise the price, what will happen is the quantity demanded will drop, but it won't drop by as large percentage as the increase in price. So for customers that are exhibiting inelastic demand, if you raise the price, your revenue would actually increase. And the answer lies in the heart of what inelastic means. Inelastic demand means that the percentage change in price is greater than the percentage change in quantity. So if you raise the price, that increase in price is going to be larger than the reduction in quantity demanded, and so the price, the effect of the higher price, will make the revenue go up. It's what I call the price effect. The higher price will cause the revenue to increase for customers that are exhibiting inelastic demand. And the last scenario, if you happen to discover in a very rare case that your customers are exhibiting unitary elastic demand, which I have illustrated in the handout on price elasticity of demand characteristics. This is a very rare case. But if you happen to discover that, your pricing strategy should be to leave the price where it is. Because if your customers are exhibiting unitary elastic demand, if you raise the price, your revenue is going to shrink. If you lower the price, your revenue will shrink. And so under conditions where you have unitary elastic demand, leave the price exactly where it is, because the revenue you're making is the most you can expect. Okay? So this is just kind of a highlight of one of the applications of price elasticity of demand. We can use it to determine how to price so as to make revenue increase. Alright? So that concludes the topics I wanted to focus on for the elasticity chapter. As always, if you have questions or comments, please send me email. I'd be happy to address them and respond to you. this chapter typically is one that if you get it, which you will, it gives you a lot of insight in terms of the power of microeconomics. It's a very useful chapter. So just do the homework, keep reading, keep studying, and you will see that this concept of elasticity is not only very powerful, but it's extremely useful. So until next week, keep studying and take care.